So, my dad was already involved in living history before I was born, and to some extent, he started off like many others of the time period, kind of in the mountain man era. He had a full buckskin costume and wore a fur hat, a foxskin hat, as a matter of fact, which I still have. Um,
That's awesome.
so, being a single father, and I started living history at about age 6. And as a single father, he wanted to go to these events. So it was either, I tag along with him or he didn't get to go. And you know who's going to win that battle? The father.
Yeah.
So I went with him initially. And, just full disclosure, it was miserable at first. As a lad of 6 years old, you grow rather quickly. So my clothing for the time period was atrocious. He made me a wool frock out of an old green army blanket, so absolutely almost worthless. My knee breeches, my stockings, my shirt were cotton, and I had just some old cowhide moccasins. So it was very uncomfortable
Yeah.
in the elements. As the years progressed over the next couple of years and my kit got a little bit better, um, I started to be intrigued by the idea of being able to live sufficiently in the woods on your own hook, reliant upon your own skills. But really, the history bug really bit me. Um, a few years later, a mutual friend of ours, a mutual mentor of ours, Cleon Grover, lived with us for quite a while. He actually lived in a tent in our front yard, and he was studying under my dad on flintlock gun building, and he really got me interested into fencing and showed me all kinds of Errol Flynn movies and the Three Musketeers, and so really that kind of solidified my love for history. Period. And my dad had shown me the 1950s Disney series on Davy Crockett and and the Daniel Boone shows and things like that. And I continue to watch those, pretty religiously, um, to get psyched up about going to living history events. And then, of course, Last Mohicans came along, and that became the new avenue to get psyched up for events. But
Yeah.
yeah, really, been involved since age 6. It took a few years for my gear and my level of self-reliance, if you will, to really make things comfortable in the woods or at a location like Manster Station, which my dad helped build. Um,
Yeah.
so it was just a progression.
Yeah. Well, you and I have kind of a similar um thing which isn't always as common as you think it might be in the hobby, which is that, we our dads got into it, and so
Yes.
we were just raised in it. It was like we didn't really have a choice in the matter,
Yep.
And
Yep.
And I say that it's surprisingly rare because, a lot of guys that got into this, like, it doesn't always stick with the kids. It doesn't always it doesn't always pass down easily. And so, you could have gone, it's that thing of like, you could have gone either way. You could have had that bad experience at 6 and been like, I don't want anything to do with this,
Oh, absolutely.
But then, you kind of find you kind of, I mean, I remember going through that period where it's sort of like, well, this is this is dad's thing. And I mean, I was psyched about all of it, but you have to hit that point where you find your own way,
Yes.
And so that's really cool. You mentioned Cleon. Of course, we also have that in common, that Cleon was an early mentor in my life, and taught me fencing among other valuable
Mm-hmm.
lessons. and
Mm-hmm.
What I always loved about Cleon was his, like, being around him. Is he's very he just really instilled like a love of, like, he always seemed very scholarly, you know.
Yes. Yes.
And so, and I don't know, you know, he is, and then, you know, you add that with this sort of Maine accent, you know, and he's just he's a very imposing figure.
Very much so.
Yeah, and very, you know, just, yeah. And so I remember him, you know, I still have them somewhere, my copies of Henry Angelo's fencing volumes, you know, that I got from
Mm-hmm.
him, and just anyway, really cool. And I think that's neat that we have that also in common. You mentioned Mansker Station, and I kind of wanted to talk about that because you had some of your earliest experiences there. Do you remember the building of Mansker Station and what all went into that, and who the major players were, and you know, what was your experiences with that?
So, Mansker Station. So, one of the Book of Buckskinnings, there's a photograph on the cover, taken at Mansker Station shortly after it opened, and I'm sitting on the front stoop of the main blockhouse. My dad's towering over me in the doorway. What a lot of people don't know is the fort wasn't even completed at that point. The whole, I believe, western wall of the stockade was still wide open.
Mm.
So yeah, it was pretty spectacular to watch that go up. David Wright, you know, was kind of the inspiration. Well, one of the inspirations behind it. He drew up the plans for it, and then the Comer brothers from, I believe, Missouri, were really the ones hired to execute the building of it. So it was, man, for many years it was such a magical place. I mean, even for those that haven't been there, it resides inside of a city park, and not, you know, 50 to 75 yards outside of the front gate of Mansker Station is a little league ball field, and 100 yards behind it is a subdivision. And I remember early on, we would have mock battles at the site, and you know, we had Native American reenactors attacking the fort and the militias inside the fort, and I'm kind of tucked away to, you know, stay safe at, you know, 6-7 years old. Mm-hmm. And the lights from the ball field were backlighting the native warriors, and you had the flashes of the gunpowder, the flintlocks going off, smoke lingering in the air, the sounds. Man, it was just it was magical. And my dad, actually being a flintlock gunsmith, my first rifle was a Davy Crockett cap gun from Cracker Barrel that he purchased and inletted a small Seidler lock in, created a wiping stick for it, changed out the trigger guard and put in a single set trigger, and he gave me a powder horn and put a little bit of powder in there so that I could prime the pan, not put any load down that, you know, thin aluminum barrel, right, but just enough to train me at an early age of that flash going off right in front of your eyes.
Oh, wow.
So I used that rifle for several years until he built my first flintlock. But yeah, the days at Mansker, and I'll tell you, growing up, you know, my best friends were all, you know, 20, 30, 40 years older than me. Yeah. And I learned a lot of things at that age that I probably shouldn't have, you know, from these older guys, a lot about life and things like that. And unfortunately, you know, I think it kind of took a toll on me in one aspect, in that, you know, at heart, I'm really an introvert. And, you know, growing up, and like we're talking about in our high school careers and things like that, instead of playing sports or going to the school dance, I got off the bus and grabbed either my flintlock or a single shot 22, and, you know, I roamed around the woods. We had about 40 acres where we lived, and I'd stay out there till literally the dinner bell rang.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. You know, I had I had a little bit of a similar thing, like, you know, growing up doing this hobby. You know, I don't think people realize, like, for me, like, I had an added dimension to the experience, which was that my dad was a sutler, you know. So
Mm-hmm.
so being on the road all the time, I mean, there was years where we did, you know, 35, 40 events a year, like, you know, weekends out. And so I didn't really have, you know, I didn't have the normal, like, you know, high school experience or like
Yeah,
anything like that. And so it was, you talk about like all your friends are, you know, 20, 30 years older than you. It's like, that's really true. And you learn things you shouldn't, and you learn things um, you know, that are lessons that you'll carry with you forever. And like a lot of really good things, you know, I don't want to paint it
absolutely.
as a
Yeah,
bad, but, yeah, it's just a different, it's a different way. It's a different way.
absolutely.
And so so Manskers really was the, you know, it really was the hub of um like kind of western
So
kind of frontier reenacting of, you know, like backcountry reenacting for a long time. And you know, in no small part was that due to uh you know, Second Company and Mark Baker and people like that. What was what was uh, what was kind of your early experiences with all of that as a, you know, young guy coming up?
So, you know, the first thing I'll say, you know, a site like Mansker Station, um, yeah, I would say somewhere in the mid '90s, this name will ring a bell to a lot of listeners. But Steve Marshall took over as the site director,
Mm.
and that's really when Mansker Station, you know, kind of propelled itself to be that hub, that, you know, that very unique backcountry type environment. And Steve Marshall's personality was ideally suited to run a site like that, all the way from just small weekend events to the large colonial fair, because he just had a leadership characteristic and charisma about him that, you know, he would chew you out and, you know, tell you whatever you're doing is not right, and but at the same time, you know, gently guide you and offer you resources to be better.
Mm.
And, you know, it could be on the extreme of, you know, you absolutely cannot enter this fight, or hey, you need to tweak this or that. But you know, overall, I gotta say, you know, over the past several years, there's a lot of talk and growth and activity around, you know, what we've dubbed the, you know, the progressive movement inside the living history world. And I really got to say, I was very fortunate in my timing to be part of the first, well, I don't want to say the first, but among the first progressive movements in the living history world. You know, when my
Yeah.
dad got started, and Captain Tom, and even Mark for that matter, I mean, really, one of the only resources that was easily obtained was seed time on the Cumberland. And Harriet Simpson Arno had done a lot of research and compiled this, you know, quasi fictional work, you know, that a lot of people clung to and kind of used as their Bible. And then, you know, in the early '90s, some of these other sources, you know, kind of come to light in our circles with Doddridge and Wood Mason and all that. And, you know, Kobuck talks about, you can't just look at Doddridge and you can't just look at Wood Mason.
Right.
But, you know, I look back on my time in the living history world, you know, my dad and those guys, for what they were doing at the time, I mean, they nailed it. And I realize that now. You know, they'd wear their hunting shirts, and we're talking on wood trips, hunting trips, week-long hunting trips. Their hunting shirts, waistcoats, you know, small shirt, knee breeches, leggings, moccasins or shoes. My dad favored hard sole shoes. You know, but then when we'd go to Manskers, they'd have a lot of the same clothing on, but they would, you know, leave the leggings behind and put on a coat or something like that. And, you know, in my rebellious early teens, you know, I wanted to be the romantic, woodland warrior with a long smock shirt and breech clout and leggings. And man, me and my dad had a lot of arguments over that. And, there's valid points to both. I mean, you can't get much more comfortable in the woods than leggings, a breechcloth, and a shirt. And, the cape on a hunting shirt as we know it today, you and I talked about this in the woods in Kentucky not too long ago. It's a pain in the neck, honestly. So it's one of those things that's kind of hard to, adjust to, but we have to, based on the documentation. So all that to say, I came into it unknowingly at a prime time for the hobby, and we've seen some shifts. The things that Mark chose to do and write about and dress, and going by the Baton Morgan and Wharton papers. I think I screwed that up, but
I know what you mean.
That was his thing. And Mark's a very dear friend of mine. He's one of my best friends in the whole world. I named my son after him. But just very fortunate to come in at that time when things were really starting to evolve, and a lot of information kind of for the first time was coming to light. I mean, folks like my dad and Captain Tom, and they're getting their start, during kind of the bicentennial celebrations where, other than the military stuff, nobody really had a clue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. You look at a lot of stuff, I always point to the, films of the era to kind of show you that a little bit, because it's like, people kind of had a general idea of what gentlemen in the 18th century, or average city dwelling people, they had an idea of what that looked like. But but then as soon as you bring a frontiersman into the story, he's wearing some god awful looking thing, it's like they really had no idea what the frontier person looked like and dressed like. And so I think by the time you get to Mark's research, and him starting to put together articles and doing stuff, I really feel like he really was on the cutting edge of what was going on at the time.
Yeah.
And took that kind of experimental archaeology that we talk about now, took it to the next level. And I actually watched one of his videos. He did the Long Hunter series, and I watched one of those videos the other day, and I was like, you know what? I think progressive people today, they kind of like to point back, and they're like, oh, that Mark Baker guy, he got everybody doing the walnut thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's true. But I think what people really missed was I was watching that and I was like, man, he's saying the exact same things that I would tell somebody if I were telling them what to do now. I just have a slightly different take on the research.
Absolutely.
But his advice at the time was not, hey, just copy what I'm doing, which basically people people did,
Correct.
Which is not his fault. But I was impressed. I was like, the research has come a long way. Mark made choices about the gear that maybe we wouldn't make today, but at the same time, it's hard to say oh, well, nobody could have ever looked like that, in the 1760s or whatever,
Absolutely.
Now, did they all look like that? And that's where you get into that thing. But I do think that era is really, like you say, I mean, what a great time when there's all this fervor going on. Last of the Mohicans was a big shot in the arm. I know people, it's no secret that I'm a huge fanboy of that film, but
oh, me too.
But yeah, but it really changed a lot of things, and it really gave people a shot in the arm, and it propelled us into this. So I feel like you're right. It was a perfect storm. And that's, it's really awesome. Tell me about like the early days at the Colonial Fair at Manskers. I think I went there for the first time maybe when I was 10, like 10 or 11. I think 10. Tell me about the magic of that place.
Oh wow! Well, so originally it started, and again, for those that that have never been to the site, the fort itself is encapsulated within an earthen berm to keep, some level of protection to the site from vandalism, but also, to provide a, kind of a boundary and almost like a pathway that you go through to exit the 20th century or 21st century and enter the 18th century. Mm-hmm. So initially the trade fair was held within that berm, which is a relatively small parcel of land, and it just continued to grow from there. And as you're aware, and as your dad's aware, it grew to be one of the biggest and one of the best. I mean, its rivals at the time, Fair at New Boston, Fort Fred probably at some point came along in there. But it was groundbreaking for this part of the country that folks could go to this site and get the items that they need, see the people they wanted to see, and experience a level of history. As we know, nothing like that would have ever taken place in the middle ground. But with what we do, we've got to, we can't be geographical snobs if we want to get the message out, allow people to experience it.
Right. Yeah.
And that's really going back to Mark and Last of the Mohicans and all that for just a second. That's really the internet and things like that have really been the game changer, because in order for people to evolve and learn and experience, there's got to be a method of communication, a method of transportation for that information. And people waited around for 6 issues of Muzzleloader to get to read Mark's next article. Yeah. And we've got to have films like Last of the Mohicans, like The Patriot, even like The Alamo, to get people excited, because one of my personal passions in this living history world is, admittedly, I am not a material culture expert. I know where to go find sources. I know the right people to listen to and trust, to utilize their sources and things like that. Yeah. What I really enjoy, I consider myself more of a social historian. I love the written word about what's taking place, in my case, in the middle ground at the time. And that's here locally and really across the Southeast. When I give presentations, a lot of times it's full of quotes and stories and things that are contemporaneous to or written down shortly thereafter, because I firmly believe that we've got to get the right balance of material culture authenticity, so that we're telling and displaying an accurate story and image. Yeah. But man, in my opinion, we've also got to tell the stories that keep people excited, that keep people revved up, that pique people's interests about these folks that came before us that we're portraying. And the trade fair at Manskers was another avenue for that. Some of my fondest memories are helping my dad set up his marquee so that he can display his guns and talk to folks. And he loved talking to folks. And anybody had any kind of issue with their flintlock or whatever, he was always willing to help them, spend hours on end. He had numerous what I call students come through the workshop and stay with us and, learn how to engrave or, do other architectural parts of the flintlock. But, Manskers, we didn't really do a lot of like educational seminars, but, you got the picture. The public could get the picture, and the living historian and reenactors could get the picture through the entertainment venues. Man, that time was a golden time for period entertainers. The Amazing Bartholomew always, sticks in my mind, and, Clockwork Clowns and all those folks. But, we'd have races. We'd have I actually broke Mark Baker's toe one time on a. He did the games several times, and we had um, logs elevated up off the ground, and basically it was a big pillow fight, and I was up there with him, and he kicked a knot on the log and broke one of his toes. But
Oh.
it was just, it was just, it was a complete picture. Somebody could go there for a day or even a few hours, and they could get this experience of a colonial gathering that would have happened in the East, a market fair of some sort. But then you walk a couple hundred yards and you're inside the fort, and people are demonstrating frontier life, and it's so magical. I love Martin Station. I've been I was at the ground floor of Martin Station, helped build that program, and even helped build the fort. And as magical as that site is because of its location, man, the heyday of Mansfer Station and the colonial affairs and the weekend events, nothing has come close in the allure and the romanticism, in the skills that were being developed, in the camaraderie and lifelong friendships since then, in my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. And when when you grow up in something and you're so intimately involved with a site like that, and then to see it kind of tragically, go the way of the buffalo,
Mm-hmm.
that's, yeah, that's hard. And so I guess this kind of would be a good place to transition towards, the building of Martin Station, because that was also a huge moment for the hobby and living history, and what the future would bring.
Yeah.
Tell me about. So my understanding was that they got the go ahead to do that. Do you know kind of who the major players there were?
It was pretty much all Billy Heck's idea. So after Billy Heck got out of the military, he started running with us in the second company, and right about that time again, even within the second company, within a cohesive group, that kept a roster, and probably at the peak 30 to 40 like-minded individuals. We went through our own kind of progressive um, transformation, and some people wanted to take the next steps and do things a little bit differently. One of my really good friends was in the second company. I remember him. He wore a indigo dyed blue, what we called at the time a hunting shirt, and it ruffled the feathers of Captain Tom and others that thought you needed to be not necessarily walnut, because I don't know if Captain Tom had anything walnut dyed, but earth tones, and kind of subdued and things like that. So
Yeah.
we kind of started going through a transformative period there. Billy Heck was running with us in the woods and at events, and I think he probably picked Steve Marshall's brain a lot, but really Billy Heck's brainchild, that he wanted to build a fort, get the Commonwealth of Virginia to back the building of a fort at Wilderness Road State Park. And after several years of trying and building support, even long before there was a fort, we were doing living history events out there,
Yeah.
timeline events and things like that, and he finally got the approval, and man, went for it. Started off building a couple of the out cabins, that are still standing today, easier and cheaper.
Mm-hmm.
And then then construction on the fort began, and that was probably a year-long process, maybe a little bit more, with a lot of volunteers, a lot of groups, a lot of guys, a lot of ladies, came in for a little taste of, what it would take to build a station like that. 99% of it was built, only using hand tools.
Yeah. Yeah, I've seen so many good pictures and of the building of it. Who are some of the characters that you have fond memories of coming in to work on the station?
Oh gosh, well, a lot of them are still around, and at the event back in May, the site was kind enough to do kind of a commemorative celebration for those of us that were there from the beginning. I believe you all had to leave. Eileen wasn't feeling well, but
Yeah.
I think uh, again, a lot of the guys I still run with or interact with today, Jesse Maines was on site quite a bit working. Ty Davis and William Brown and some of the American Long Rifle Association guys would come in and out and help with that. A lot of my second company guys, and it was a labor of love, and a lot of those folks, like I said, are still around. Some of them are long gone, at least, from my perspective. The folks up in your neck of the woods and up into Pennsylvania, I don't get to see much at all. So I'm not sure if they're even involved in the hobby any longer. But, in its own right, that became a magical place just because of the geography. You can't help but walk into the fort area with the backdrop of the ridge line behind you, and just be in complete awe.
Oh,
and,
yeah.
On one hand, understand, man, I know why they built a fort in this general area. It's not on the exact location where it was originally. But you also think, why the heck did they pick, this location for the fort? How did they even get here?
Yeah.
It helps you appreciate the arduous journey, to even get to that point. And that's not even probably the roughest part into the middle ground. So
yeah, it's pretty, it's pretty spectacular. It's the only site that I know, really one of the only sites that I know where you can go and you can stand in the middle of that little valley next to the fort and just turn all the way around 360 degrees, and you're not going to see one thing that's sort of out of place.
Absolutely.
And that's a rare, for a historic site, that's a rare, like even Colonial Williamsburg doesn't have that.
Sure. Yep.
You're always going to see some little hint that modernity is around.
Yes. Yes.
But I think there's so many cool pictures from that time period and stuff, and the sort of shenanigans that went on. A couple of the events that you guys had there for the raid, if I remember correctly, the station wasn't even complete yet. Or maybe not for the raid, but for like some of those first couple events.
Correct. Yeah.
The station wasn't complete, and so you guys, I've seen pictures of like guys coming up to get paid. They did like a payroll, payout for the guys that were doing service, and some kind of militia muster happening, and there's like guys on horses out there, and I mean that's something you don't see a lot of even now. All the guys that were bringing horses out to events, kind of stopped doing that, or some of them have passed away. I'm thinking of like Wayne Milton,
correct. Yeah.
So there was it.
Yeah.
It felt alive. A lot of those early events, it felt really alive and lived in. Oh,
100%. Yeah. One of the first big events out there, and it was really the precursor to the raid. Before there was a fort, we several of us, there's probably 12 or 15 of us, we set up this, we scrounged every piece of canvas that we could find, and we set up this, I don't even know what to call it. We called it bedlam, but it was this, we pieced it together as best we could to make a shelter, and we're, sleeping on the ground, and it still gets pretty chilly, in Cumberland Gap in May in the morning, and Jason Gatliff and I were in bedlam, as we called it, and Steve Jinglebach, and somewhere in the middle of the night, Steve, who's famous for going barefooted, started to get a little chilly, so he, in the dark, reached around trying to find something he'd cover his feet with, and he found one stocking, and we found out the next morning that on the other foot was one of Jason's mittens. and that helped him get through the night. So, yeah, a lot of fond memories there.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so Martin Station gets built uh, kind of in the midst of the market. The Colonial Fair at Manskers is still going on for, you know, a handful of years into the early
Yes.
2000s, and then it kind of dries up
Hmm.
with some changes in leadership, and it just kind of, you know, that's a whole other story. But
Yeah.
um, and then uh, the site. Well, before I get to this, I guess I need to ask this question too, because I think this happened somewhere around in those years. You were on the now infamous Cherokee campaign. Is that correct?
Oh, yeah. Yep.
Um, tell me, kind of who was involved in that, and what was the goal, and what did you guys end up doing?
So that was actually our, I believe, our second large um, woods based scenario at recreating actual events. The first one was we did a survey, and then we survey party in Big South Fork, and then we did Point Pleasant, and then the Cherokee campaign. And that was really the brainchild of William Brown from North Carolina, Tony Holbrook, and Herman Stainbrook, colloquially known as Captain Titus, around Martin Station, who was, oh gosh, I've known him since I was 6 years old. Or myself and his son were woods running buddies for many years. I remember one time we were at our station camp in southern Middle Tennessee with the second company. We had two station camps where we built half-face shelters and would live out of that for days on end. And Herman's truck had just gotten broken into, and they took pretty much everything out of the back of his truck, including his blankets. So he came to this camp with just a half of a British, uh, white British military blanket, and I don't remember the time of the year other than it was cold.
Yeah.
And I got up in the middle of the night and stoked the fire, and I gave him my blanket, and he peacefully slept the rest of the night, and I'm curled around this fire, half of me burning up, half of me freezing. But from then on, we always joke that I saved his life. But Cherokee campaign again was Herman, Captain Titus, William Brown, Tony Holbrook. Really kind of their brainchild, along with Gary Barker and his group. And I guess kind of the biggest impediment to that group is we didn't have a great enough number of native reenactors to effectively do what we sought out to do. So myself and Jason Gatliff and Jesse Maines and Kelly Taylor was there, and did a really good native impression. Um, he might actually been the only one, but me and Jason and Jesse decided we would help him out. So the scenario kind of twisted for us the moment we arrived. We were planning on being in camp with the militia, and that was just not to be. So we actually spent the entire event moving between Gary Barker and his crew's camp and the militia's camp, which was, gosh, there's probably a mile or more that separated the two. And we just had running battles wherever we went. We'd wreak havoc, and just had a really good time. So I can't really describe to you the ambiance or the environment inside the militia camp, but for us, it was a lot of fun, taking pot shots. And at one point, me and Jesse and Jason snuck up on the camp and caught Herman, Captain Titus, off guard. And just a lot of good memories like that. And some of those events that kind of had force on force, are some of my most cherished events. I believe you and was it you and Dwayne or you and David talking about the force on force stuff and how that's changed. But that really, in many ways, hones your talents and skills in other aspects. And, one of my most cherished memories is, the events. I used to travel down to Fort Toulouse in Alabama quite a bit, and we can talk about that now or later. But the Cherokee campaign was really an effort to, again, just take a snapshot of history and see how we can unpack it and see how it unfolds, over a 4 or 5 day period.
Yeah.
All the way from the logistics of, moving livestock and horses and things like that to, having a working camp. We had ladies in the camp that were cooking for the officers. There was a pond nearby that we gigged frogs out of, and, made Captain Titus frog legs and, things of that nature. Somebody brought, pickled eggs and I believe pickled lobster for the officers, and, just things like that. Just trying to pluck out those vignettes of history and, like I said, unpack them and see how they unfold for us using the same tools, the same equipage, the same clothing, and, hopefully a very similar mindset, and see how it turns out for us, 200 years later.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it really does take, I think, talking about like battles and things and doing different kind of immersive stuff like that, it really does teach you different things about, how to maintain your gear, how to maintain your gun, how to, you can have the best set of clothes and the fanciest, whatever in the hobby. And, but if you can't kind of hack it in some of these, scenarios, it really just, there's more to it than just, hand sewing a shirt or, being able to stand there and talk, about material culture. I think the other aspect of it is, putting yourself into those situations and saying like, okay, I actually have some knowledge now of how to keep your gun working under fire, if you're in a situation like that. And, because I've been in many situations where guys, guy couldn't keep his gun working or whatever. And it's like, well, you would have been,
should have practiced. Yeah.
That could have been a death sentence for you in the right circumstance, and so, that stuff to me is just as important, just to give you an appreciation and also just another skill, that you can take and present to the public later.
Well, absolutely. One kind of tidbit that Mark Baker used to always write about, and again, it's that balance between, what can we prove historically versus, what works well, even not using a modern mindset, but the whole concept of wearing your powder horn and shot bag high and tight, under your arm. He's caught a lot of flack about that over the years.
Yeah.
But I'm here to tell you, it works. It's more comfortable, and you can maneuver. And it's things like that just, the variety of things that we do in the living history world, give you the opportunity to experiment with. And that's the other thing I'm super lucky with, is that, joining this at such a young age, I was able to hone a lot of the skills needed to survive in the wilderness, long before I started reading, a lot of the primary documents.
Yeah.
A lot of guys nowadays that are getting into it are trying to juggle both, and it can be pretty difficult. I'm a firm believer in, measure twice and cut once. Read the documents before you, make a purchase or make a garment or, whatever. But, the skills, if that's your cup of tea, is actually putting these skills and this lifestyle, into action, you got to have the skills. You got to be able to start a fire. You got to be able to cook your food. You got to be able to, field dress a deer, things like that. So.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And I think that's, I guess we'll kind of, I'm trying to kind of guide this in a certain way, and I'll jump ahead now because I think it'll tie in. But you and I had never been in the woods together until very recently, and
Correct.
I have to say, like, when I started this interview series and I was trying to figure out, like, okay, who am I going to interview and who's who, and I was talking to people about it, like, your name came up multiple times. I mean, I knew I was going to interview you, but other people brought your name up multiple times because they were like, well, that dude's basically, he's a legend in this hobby. and
That's flattering.
and I think it's because, I mean, in large part, you were one of the names that got kind of associated with Mark's writing, and and you've been at this a long time, and I think, and so I was really, when you signed up for our recent immersion event back in the spring, I was really excited about that because I was like, oh, I knew I was going to have a couple guys who hadn't done these kind of things before, and I knew I was going to have some guys that had, but then when I saw you were interested, I was like, oh man, this is going to be good because he's been there, done that, and just has so much experience. And just watching you get out, you got to the event, you got out of the car or the truck, you got your gear together, and it was just like, all right, the man knows what he's doing. We got down in the woods, and just the things that you kind of had on hand, and what it's when you've been doing it for a long time that you get with somebody and you're like, oh, okay, I can learn something here, and I was glad that some of the other guys got to, a couple of the newer guys got to be in the woods with you in that way, because it's good to have those experienced people. What, you kind of hadn't been in the woods like that in a while. What, you were kind of fired up there a few times.
Big time.
What was your experience with this past spring and kind of getting your feet back into the water a bit?
Yeah, so and thank you for all that. I mean, it's very humbling. I love, on whatever level I can, contributing to the world of living history. Life gets in the way, and priorities, not only for yourself but kind of the people you run with, shift. And like you said at the beginning of this tale, most of my friends are 20, 30, 40, 50 years older than me. And many of them have passed on, including my father. So, when you invited me on this trip, yes, I was very pumped. As I said earlier, I'm very much an introvert in modern life. I don't like going to big cities, and I don't want to say I don't enjoy, in the 18th century context, going to forts and trade fairs and market fairs and things like that, because I do. But I have to go into it with the right mindset of, I'm going here for one of two or three reasons. One is to help educate the public. Two is I'm going to learn more about this aspect, the more civilized aspect of 18th century life, or a combination of the two. But I would much rather be in the woods, honing my skills, never stop learning, and I hope I never, stop teaching what little I can. But the opportunity to get out, and I didn't know who you had coming, and it was a great group of guys. Of course, I've known Will Manier since he was in diapers, and never met David McClanahan. Corresponded with him, and he's actually made me some clothes. Always been a nice guy, but man, it was so cool meeting him. You just tell, just by the way he is, that he's just a good dude, just down to earth, and I was really looking forward to meeting him. But No, I love getting out in the woods for, whatever reason. I do enjoy, there has to be, in order to get the most out of your time in the woods, there needs to be a scenario of some sort, or learning objectives or experiments or things like that. And when I found out what you were trying to do, David talked about it when you interviewed him. He talked about, waking up in the morning and hearing the axes. Well, from our perspective, we didn't really think about that until he brought it up.
Yeah.
Like, wow, 250 years ago, a Cherokee or a Shawnee or a Creek Indian minding their own business starts hearing axes. That even today, that gives me goosebumps.
Yeah.
That in and of itself, his comment, his experience in that made my weekend and made it all completely worth it. Everything else was icing on the cake.
Yeah.
But the scenario you had for us to go into the woods, we had a couple of guys, working hides. We were gonna, build a half-face shelter, start establishing our station camp, and all the while there's a threat looming out there.
Yeah.
I just, that was very appealing to me. And like you said, you and I haven't had a chance to be in the woods together. Jumped at the opportunity and had a ball. And yes, I got fired up a couple times, probably yelled some things at our native friends that, although historically correct, I hope they didn't take offense to, but, man, it was just, it's real. And that's what I strive for. That's what I love, is those real moments.
Yeah. Yeah.
We were exhausted at the end of the day. And
yeah.
That's historically correct.
Yeah. It really, those moments are my, definitely, it really is. It's kind of like what you were saying about, I like going here and I like going there, but those moments in those more immersive settings are it's just what I, live for, when it comes to the hobby. And yeah, was really glad to have you on that, little campaign. And, yeah, had a blast. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's a small world. So, one of the guys that went with us, never met him before, found out he, currently lives just a few miles from where I grew up. So just a small world. And again, the people that are involved in this hobby, by and large are just, some of the best people you'd ever want to, ever meet. Their love of country, their love of the hundreds of years of toil and strife and celebration and victory and loss and, birth and death that this country's experienced. We're trying our best to do it justice.
Yeah, absolutely. And tell, tell the whole story and really, I feel like everybody's, there, I feel like we're in another time, like you were talking about in the 90s, we're in another time of pushing it further and taking the ball forward. And,
yes.
And it's, it's awesome. I'm really enjoying like how much just really good, there's just a lot of cool stuff happening. I'm really excited about it. So,
and that communication, we never had that ability to communicate, you and, not David, but, his name just slipped my mind. Dwayne. We're talking about the Augusta County Militia, and the key between the key behind the Augusta County Militia, the second company, other groups of that nature. You've got to have a charismatic and polarizing leader that keeps it together, and you've got to have good lines of communication. And our lines of communication have never been better now with the internet and email and social media, and this hobby. I don't even really like to call it a hobby, because it's so much more than that. Every time we put our moccasins on, especially if a member of the public's going to see us, it's a noble calling for us to be able to demonstrate and talk about history.
Yeah.
But that communication is absolutely vital.
Yeah, absolutely. It really has, changed the game in a lot of key ways and a lot of really good ways, and just being able to disseminate all that information quickly. And um yeah, speaking of the public and kind of shifting it back in that direction, I want to talk really quickly about kind of as we wrap things up. I want to talk about Bledsoe's.
Yeah.
So Bledsoe sort of took over kind of what Manskers had done for years, as Manskers kind of changed, leadership. And you've become very intimately involved with Bledsoe's. Uh, Tell me about your kind of role and your transition into that, and what you've tried to accomplish there.
Yeah, yeah. So Bledsoe Ford Historical Park in Castellan Springs, Tennessee, is the original site of Bledsoe Station. It's one of the few locations, at least in this part of the country, if not, on a more macro scale, where we know the exact location of the fort and have a historic, protected site around it. We also have three dwellings from the 1780s and 90s that have been dismantled from their original location and rebuilt on the site of the fort. Two log cabins and one stone cottage. Um, I first became involved with Bledsoe's back in the early 2000s. I had moved here, and some friends of mine were on the board at the park, and the historical program is governed by a board of directors. They asked me if I'd be on the board because of my passion for history, and I served a term or two there, and then didn't really have a whole lot of affiliation with the running of the site, other than I would go out and do demonstrations and programs and talks and things like that throughout the intervening years. But then in 2020, the president of the board wanted to back off, getting up in age. He's a professional farmer, and needed to spend more time on his farm and with his family. So he asked if I would take it over, and I agreed to. It's just a really cool site, and the history of the area. If present day Nashville is the heart of what would become Tennessee, then Bledsoe's are the lungs. Everything kind of funneled through here. It played an important role in the settlement and development of what would become Tennessee. And several years ago, we pitched the idea to the board long before I was the president of the association to host the Colonial Fair. And really, that request came from some of the larger sutlers at the time.
Yeah.
They wanted, once Manskers ended its Colonial Fair, it made it very difficult for some of these sutlers to go from Fort Frederick the first weekend in May to, historically, then they'd come back down to Manskers, and then they'd go over to Martin's. So it was a 3 weekend in a row, kind of a schedule for them, and it was very disruptive if they had to go back home to either Missouri or wherever they're from on that weekend between Fort Frederick and Martin's. So we toyed with the idea. We talked to some of the sutlers to see if we get support, and again, they're like, yes, that would be a huge help to us, so we wouldn't have to put all those extra miles. So we did it for about 10 or 11 years, and it was labor intensive since we're all volunteer based. We have no employees at Bledsoe's Fort. At the time, the leadership of the association didn't really understand the value or what we were trying to do. They viewed it as they were letting us put on this event at the site, rather than our true intention is to, do it in cooperation with them to get people out to the site, get people familiar with the site, and, share the love of history.
Right.
And just, quite honestly, the weather very rarely worked out for us. We had a couple of years with tornadoes. We had an immense flood in the area one year, and crowds both on the sutler side, because a lot of them had started to retire. Some of the larger ones had started to retire. Our public visitation crowd started to decline, and quite frankly, we were exhausted. So we we made the unfortunate choice, to end the run, but then we had, full intentions of, doing some other historical type events out there. We've hosted a fall shooting match, rifle frolic, for many years, and do different events like that. So, my goal as the president of the association and overseer of the park is to really, I would love nothing more for historical groups to use the park. Like I said, we've got 3 fully functional, dwellings there that we allow people to stay in, cook in the fireplace, sleep in the beds, do whatever. I would really love for it to be a hub for historical groups to come out and put on programs and,
oh yeah,
even just come out and camp for the weekend. So, that's my involvement in Bledsoe in a nutshell.
yeah. Well, and I as this interview will release, at the time that this interview will release, we'll be about 3 weekends away from the revival of the rifle frolic.
Yes,
and you were kind enough to approach me last year at the CLA show, and we talked about kind of making it like a kind of a militia muster / rifle frolic event. And things have been going good, getting ready for that. And I'm really looking forward to that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you agreeing to do it. I've been watching, how you try to teach folks and mentor folks and, get information out there. And I appreciate your, strive for authenticity. But, at the same time, you're not, too hard-nosed about it. And, as demonstrated by your event this spring, you're welcoming to those that aren't quite at a certain level, as long as they have the desire to learn. And that's always been my philosophy as well. In this day and age, there's not much excuse for people to not be as authentic as possible. Again, going back to those communication channels, and information at our fingertips. But everybody's got a starting point. Everybody's got a niche in the hobby that they enjoy. And, as long as they're striving to attain the next level, and it's a ladder, it's not there's not just 2 tiers of this hobby. It's a ladder. It's a multi-story building.
Yeah.
And so, I appreciate your approach with it, and, appreciate you taking me up on my offer to put together an event out there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, that taking people kind of where they are and saying like, hey, if you're willing to listen to me for just a minute and kind of, maybe tweak this and tweak that over here and here, like borrow this and, whatever, you can really bring people along, and give them an experience that they wouldn't have had otherwise if you just, I mean, sure, I've had to turn people away from stuff that I've put on or done because, it was just clear that we had different goals. But I've had, many times where, it is just a matter of reaching out and saying, hey, I would love to have you. Would you consider, changing this, or can I let you borrow this or whatever? And it's a good philosophy. I always say, like, if you kind of make the standards high from the get-go and you put them out there, that'll take care of the people that you would rather, not apply, who are just, it's nothing wrong with it, but people who are just kind of set in what they do, and that's fine. But then be willing to give that person who's actually willing to try, kind of give them a little bit of grace, as they come in. And I always just, you just treat that stuff as it comes to you, on a case by case basis. Yeah. So I'm really looking forward to it. We've got a good group of people that have signed up so far, and it's not too late. If you're listening to this, you can you can come and have a good time with us down at Bledsoe's, September 19th through the 21st. So
yeah, come on down and like I said, be right in the pulmonary vein of the civilization that would spring out of the middle ground. It's such a rich area in history.
Yeah, and we're gonna do some neat stuff too, and the muster portion is gonna be fun and also educational, and so yeah, check that out, and then come try to beat Ehrin Ehlert in a shooting match. Well, cool. Well, I think that's a good. We can kind of put a pin in it there. Maybe we'll do another one of these down the road, because I'm sure there's a million other things we could talk about.
Yeah, I'd be glad to.
Yeah, but